huge review of vaccines suggests the AstraZeneca jab does raise the risk of blood clots and another serious condition that can cause bleeding. However, the researchers, led by the University of Oxford, found that the risk of such problems was still much higher after actually catching COVID. The team said the findings showed the substantial benefit of vaccination. Our health correspondent Naomi Grimley reports.
As more of us get vaccinated, Britain's scientists are learning more about the possible side effects that come with getting jabbed. But the news is reassuring. According to this study led by Oxford University, for every 10 million people vaccinated with AstraZeneca, an extra 107 would be hospitalised or die from thrombocytopaenia, which can cause internal bleeding and hemorrhages. But that's nearly 9 times lower than the risks of the same condition following natural infection, and crucially no higher than with other vaccines such as the flu jab. The AstraZeneca vaccine also had a slightly higher risk of blood clots in veins, but again this was 200 times lower than the risk if you caught COVID. In those receiving the Pfizer jab, there was an increased risk of stroke, but this was still 12 times lower than the risks that came with infection. The researchers hope it will provide context to some of the headlines over the last few months.
We were studying a range of bleeding and clotting outcomes. The vast majority of people, the overwhelming majority of people vaccinated don't experience these. So in relation to these outcomes, these vaccines appear to be very, very safe. A small number of people do get these outcomes, sadly. These risks seem to be comparable with other vaccines, such as the flu vaccine. And the other thing I wanted to say really in this context is that if you develop COVID-19, the risks of these same outcomes from our data are just so much higher.
This pandemic is still continuing to wreak havoc around the globe. 68,000 people died of COVID last week worldwide, and the vast majority of those lives would have been saved if they'd been vaccinated. Naomi Grimley, BBC News.
Let's talk to Dr. Andrew Preston from the University of Bath. And I wonder, this is such a huge study looking at the records of 29 million vaccinated people, what you take from this?
Well, as your report said, I think it really clarifies this sort of decision that people are having to make when choosing whether to be vaccinated or not, in terms of the risk that's been widely publicised, admittedly rare, but still a risk nonetheless from these adverse events following vaccination, compared with the very real risk, of course, of adverse events following COVID itself. And I think that this report really quantifies that risk using, as you say, a very, very large data set. And it's clear that I think it's probably been slightly less recognised that these rare blood clotting disorders are a very real risk of complication from COVID itself, not just from the vaccines.
Do you think this will be reassurance enough for those who are still questioning whether to have the vaccination?
I certainly think it will help some people who have genuine concern over this particular aspect of vaccination and trying to weigh up the risk for themselves. And of course, with the virus still circulating at such high levels now, I think that this study really needs to make clear that it's been widely discussed that if you're not vaccinated, you're probably inevitable that you're going to catch COVID at some point over the next year or so, given the levels of circulation we have. And this study clearly indicates you then run a much greater risk of these rare blood disorders than getting the vaccine. I don't think it's going to persuade some of those who are just ideologically opposed to vaccines.